Peace, my people. You're tuning into I Must Be Bugging, where Black, gifted, and otherwise neurodivergent folks celebrate our special flavors. If you've ever questioned your perspective in a world built for the masses, welcome home. I'm your host, Sheldon Gay, and I appreciate you joining me on this journey as a late-identified Black, gifted man. Together, we'll rewrite the script on neurodiversity by celebrating our differences, challenging the status quo, and breaking free from old narratives that label us as deficient. In each episode, we'll explore the stories, experiences, and of course the curiosities of Black gifted adults and other neurodivergent people who are underrepresented or unidentified in a world where normal can also mean harmful. So continue with me on this journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and acceptance. I Must Be Bugging is creating safe spaces, sparking conversations, and making sure our voices are heard. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me for this episode. This is your host, Sheldon Gay. As always, super excited to have you here. Before we get started, I'm going to ask that if you've been enjoying this podcast, go ahead, pause it, share your favorite episode on social media, send it in a text to someone, send it in an email to someone, help to share what we're doing here with someone. If you know that it's meant something to you, I'm sure that you know at least one other person for whom this might, at least plant a seed, right? Maybe they're not identifying in the ways that we do. And maybe you don't necessarily identify in the way that I do, but you know someone who might. I'm asking you, go ahead, like I said, pause this, go ahead and share. And if you paused it earlier and it sounds weird now, I'm just kidding. No, please do share. Please do leave some thoughts in the comments. If you've seen me share this somewhere, if you've seen someone else share this somewhere, and there was a particular part of an episode that touched you, or that was interesting, or that resonated, please leave a comment. Okay? So, having said that, again, my name is Sheldon Gay. I am your host. My pronouns are he and him. I am a 40-ish year old Black man. I am what we would call light-skinned. I have black hair. It's curly hair. It's kind of faded on the side and the back, although now I'm kind of feeling it. It's just about time to get a cut. The top is a little bit long. I've got a little bit of a goatee, and currently I've also got some little sideburns. The barber had me halfway thinking I could at some point grow a beard, but I'm not quite ready to play myself like that. So, but that's my physical description. Oh yeah, I'm sitting here right now in a white tee. And yeah, so and today I'm not wearing my over ear headphones. I got my earbuds in. So anyway, having said that, this is the first episode in a series that I've been promising to talk about as it relates to self-awareness. And so, this will definitely be multiple episodes. In fact, I've already got the next episode kind of queued up. I had to split this was going to be one episode, and I realized it's going to be too long, and so I split it up into two. Today is going to be fundamentally just about the basics, just the understanding before we kind of get into the more complex thoughts and theories and realizations, right? So just today is just really about the basis of what we're going to be talking about as it relates to self-awareness. And a big part of that is coming into the space, recognizing when you've been saying, it must be them and not me, or maybe you've heard someone saying that, right? And so how do we start to explore that? This topic, this series as a whole is pretty daunting, I must say, right? And daunting in the fact that there's just so much to talk about. I mean, any one of these particular topics could have its own series, let alone its own episode. And so there's so much to say, there's so many angles to come at it from, so to that end, just bear with me. I'm acknowledging that, I'm feeling that pressure. I'm dealing with that pressure. And it's that self appointed pressure, right? To say and explain it all, while I'm also dealing with the feelings around understanding that that's not a realistic, expectation of myself, to think that I can just do it all. As much as there's a million things in my mind, trying to download all of them and again tell it from every single possible angle. I mean, every day I wake up, self-awareness is a thing that I'm thinking about. So trying to tell every story that comes to mind around this is just not possible. But having said that, and maybe, to that point, I may stay on a topic longer than needed, right? Or jump around more than you might expect. And so just be prepared for that. Um, and if there are aspects that you like me to speak to that I don't speak about after you listen to this episode, leave that in the comments or send me a message on Instagram. I'd love to hear, what you'd like to hear, what you thought that I, would add to the soup that we're making here. This topic again is super personal to me as someone who's, frankly, my existence is defined by my deep and complex thoughts and my overall introspection. I spend every day, almost every waking moment thinking, right? Thinking about my own thinking. And sometimes that does admittedly lead to unnecessary rumination. And other times it also leads to, some magical insights. And frankly, I don't separate or, make those mutually exclusive. Sometimes that unnecessary rumination through that process, some magical insights came out of them. And sometimes those magical insights, that good piece of that nugget is there, but then it just leads me down a rabbit hole that's not, helpful, or at least it takes me off of my productivity path, right? So, again, just acknowledging all of these. And thank you to the truck that decides to go by. But my desire to speak to this and to the subsequent insights, it has ties to my life, both my personal experience, right, of self-discovery, as well as my relationships with other people, whether it be family, friends, or others, right? It also has ties to things that I've heard as I've gotten to know other people like me, other neurodivergent people, other Black people, other folks who maybe, again, we don't share all of the same identities, but just in speaking with other people and understanding their experience. Um, and so this is not just something I read somewhere. This is informed by a lot of different things. Um, as well, knowing this self-awareness journey, I want to kind of at the beginning, before we really, really dig in, I want to say, you should stop listening now if you're not prepared to have your thoughts and experiences challenged. And I don't mean invalidated, right? I mean, if saying water can't be wet, or if me quoting my favorite Black feminist to say that patriarchy has no gender, if those things seriously irritate you or makes you uncomfortable, you may not enjoy this episode, and it may honestly feel a little traumatic. And I don't want you to choose that experience, right? I want to kind of give you that um, warning up front. Also, this work can open up thoughts and realizations that could be incredibly uncomfortable. Healing work involves facing dark corners of ourselves and sometimes surprising areas of ourselves that we didn't know were there. And only you can determine if you're in a place where you have the tools and support to deal with something that may come up for you. So I just want you to be, again, mindful of that. And again, to be very, very, very clear, nothing, absolutely nothing I say here is meant to invalidate anyone's experience, but rather offer us methods by which we can move past painful or simply unclear narratives to claim truths that allow us to live more joyously and in alignment with ourselves, right? Because that's when we get to the peace that we really, really seek fundamentally. Okay. So, having said that, I am going to start us out with something that I typically do, which is, some quotes. And so the first quote is from Aristotle, right? It says, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." The second quote is a Baldwin quote. And I love this quote, and I'm going to probably read it twice because it's just that, important. But Baldwin says, "It is rare indeed that people give. Most people guard and keep. They suppose that it is they themselves and what they identify with themselves that they are guarding and keeping, whereas what they are actually guarding and keeping is their system of reality and what they assume themselves to be." And I'm going to say this one more time. It is rare indeed that people give. Most people guard and keep. They suppose that it is they themselves and what they identify with themselves that they are guarding and keeping, whereas what they are actually guarding and keeping is their system of reality and what they assume themselves to be. And so again, that's a Baldwin quote from The Fire Next Time that I love, and it properly sets the context for understanding that, again, there are some thoughts that we have, some beliefs that we have that we naturally, like biologically, are designed to hold on to because they feel like they are a part of ourselves. And so this is going to be a journey into identifying how do we figure out how we identify what's ourselves and what are things that we can let go. And anyway, so let me first start by sharing something that is just fundamental to this entire concept that we're going to discuss here. So give me 1 second. And for those who are not watching on YouTube, I am pulling up some slides. And so this is going to be something new that I'm going to try to do in season 2. So if you are subscribed to the podcast elsewhere, I'm going to do my best to include all of these different things in the show notes so that you can also kind of dig through them. I'm also going to do my best to describe them. But as well, feel free to join us on, YouTube and watch from there. Again, I'm trying to limit that as much as possible, but at the same time, I want there to be a more immersive experience. So just be prepared for that. Having said that, what are we looking at here? So, um, let me describe it, right? There's a black background. Within the black background is a circle. This circle is kind of like this blue white lightning circle. So it's like pulsating. It almost looks like, you know, we had the eclipse recently, right? So, and the solar flares, right? So it's almost like if you imagined the center of the sun was black, and you saw all the solar flares flowing over the top, but what you see really is just this circle, and within it are two, you know, if you want to use some fancy words, right, amorphous objects, but they're basically just like, you know, two objects that are differently shaped. And not only are they sort of not symmetrically shaped, right? They are differently shaped to each other. And so what what this represents and why I'm bothering to show it to you is I want us to get to this level of understanding um, that this large circle represents everything that anyone could ever possibly know about the universe, right? And really, it's everything that exists in the universe. Because what these inner two objects actually represent are the things that are possibly humanly knowable ever. And so if you're watching on YouTube or if you're imagining this in your mind, what this represents is this acknowledgement that there are some things that are just totally unknowable. We should not, we should be aware, right? Self-awareness, right? We should be aware that as much as we know, as brilliant as we are, as many millennia humans could exist on this planet or other planets, frankly, right? There are some things about the universe that we'll just never know. And that's meant to humble us, but again, just provide that context. Now, why do we have two different objects in here? Those two different objects, and again, this is oversimplified, but it's to make the conversation more tangible. These two objects represent what I would call, a or for lack of a better term, right now I'm using the best term that I have right now: a neurodivergent knowing and a neurotypical knowing. And again, we can debate about the challenges of those wordings. And in fact, I was laughing before I started recording because I'm like, in 5 years and 10 years, we'll probably have different words and we'll kind of cringe at the use of those words, because even today I cringe at the use of those words, and I know many within my circles cringe at the use of those words. But for simplicity's sake, just accept those for what they are. Consider them to just be just that. So having said that, again, the if you notice, if you're watching, and let me describe it, the neurotypical one is the one on the right. That's the one that I'm representing as the neurotypical one on the right. First of all, neither one of these knowings is larger per se than the other. And that's purposeful, because I don't want us to think that we, as neurodivergent people, or particularly as gifted people, have more knowing overall than the entirety of humanity. I don't want us to think about it like that. What you see, though, is that this more neurotypical, or this neurotypical object, which represents them, is less spiky, right? It still, though, has some fine bumps to it. It doesn't mean that there's nothing sort of textured about their experience. To that point, there's also some asymmetry to the object, because again, their experience still does include things that aren't necessarily linear. And then the neurodivergent one on the left is one that's definitely more spiky. And I made it that way because it represents the intensity with which we experience, many of us experience things, right? And the seemingly very distinct way in which our knowledge may divert from a center knowing, a central knowing, let me say it that way. And again, we'll come back to this, and there's plenty of opportunity to have discussion about this. But the other thing that I want to point out is that there is overlap, right? There are things that we fundamentally, as humans, all have the opportunity to know and that we share, right? And these are our common experiences. And so we should not think about these as two completely separate things where you can never know anything about me and I can never know anything about you. No, there are common experiences. And there are certainly things, about how we interact with life that we just won't understand about each other. And that's fine, because that just makes us, who we are. And it means that there's opportunity to share and to learn about someone else's experience. Okay. I've definitely spent too much time talking about this, because this is not the 100% focus of this conversation. But I hope that illustration was helpful. So, having said that, let's go back to, again, the question of self-awareness and why you would even want to look in the mirror. Well, this can be necessary if you're noticing a few different things, right? It may be time to look in the mirror if relationships are breaking down. And again, as you should know, if you listen to this podcast a lot, when I say relationships, I'm talking about the process by which we relate to anyone else and to other things, right? So that doesn't have to be romantic. That could be your friend. That could be your family member. That could be your business partner. It could be anybody. And it could also be, again, your relationship to concepts, whatever it is. But if you notice that they're breaking down, they're not stable, you're having issues communicating with people, this may be an opportunity to look in the mirror and figure out what's going on. Because again, as I started out saying, right, if the mentality is it must be them and not me, there's an opportunity to investigate. Maybe you're not meeting your goals. Maybe you're, working hard. You're, you got your eyes on the prize. You've set a plan out, but you're just not meeting your goals for some reason. Well, that may mean that there's an opportunity for reflection. Is the goal reasonable? Is it really something that you want? Maybe you consider yourself to be pursuing something that, excuse me, fundamentally you don't actually want. That's another possibility. Maybe you're unhappy despite all your best efforts, right? Maybe you're doing the work, right? You're reading the books, you're going to the meetings, you're talking with all the people, you're whatever, you're doing all these different things, but you still feel unhappy, right? You're making all the money, you're doing all the different things, but you're still unhappy. Well, that definitely is an opportunity to look in the mirror to figure out, well, why would that be? If it seems like you're meeting the same types of people and they're reacting to you in the same types of ways, again, not stripping away anybody's accountability for how they treat you, not invalidating your experience around how they treat you, but maybe the question becomes, why are you choosing spaces where these people are? Why are you maintaining spaces where these people are? Maybe your ability to draw a boundary needs some help, right? Again, these are just questions and thoughts, right? This is a reason why you may need to look in the mirror. Or maybe, forget all of this. Maybe you just personally like periodically checking in to see where you are and how you're showing up for yourself and others. And now, in the interest of time, there's a list of, signs that you could be a toxic, person. I may put that in the show notes, but I'm not going to delve into that because that's not really the focus, right? But we just talked about, well, is this for me? Is this something I need to be doing? Okay, well, those are some signs that, it may be for you. But let's take a step even further back to talk about, let's talk about what self-reflection even is. So the first thing is to think about, what is cognition, and in simple terms, it's just the way that we think, right? A more complex way of thinking about it, I would suggest, is that we call it the outcome or outcomes of how we process the way our experiences interact with our beliefs, right? So we believe the world to be a certain way, and we receive stimuli, right? We bump into experiences and information and data from what's happening around us, right, in the world, and we get some outcome that's the mashup of those things, and that's our thought, right? That's what a thought about something is, right? We believe that it's cold outside, or we believe that it's whatever. It's spring now, almost, I guess verging on summer at some point, right? And I believe that this time of year it should be warm. I go outside and maybe it's a cold, rainy day. Well, I have a thought. My thought being, this don't make no sense, or whatever it is, right? But like, my thought is that mashup between whatever my belief is and what I experience. And this is just the basis of cognition. Okay. It's only important for me to share that because here's the key thing: thinking about what's called metacognition, which is essentially thinking about thinking. And it's not just letting a thought arrive, right? But wondering, what is the source of that thought and the nature of that thought? So, why is it that I believe that, you know, um, whatever, April is a time when it's spring? Well, that's probably because I'm from the northern hemisphere, right? If I went to South Africa, I'd have a very different experience. But if I never question, wait a second, why is it, if I went to South Africa in the northern hemisphere's winter and it was warm, I again, my beliefs and my experience would bump up against each other, and I'd get a thought. And my thought might be, what in the world? Right? Why how are y'all having summer down here when it's supposed to be winter? Well, the metacognition, right, is thinking about thinking, is realizing, oh, the reason why I think that is because my experience has been completely contained to a part of the world where that's true. But that's not necessarily true for everyone. I think you all see where I'm kind of going with this, right? And so if you're deep into your work, you'll also be familiar with, who's thinking this thought, what's behind. If I'm observing the thought, well, what's observing the thought, right? And that's a whole thing. How do we know? Let's bring this to like some more of like real examples, right? So like, how do we know something is wet, right? You can reach into to get something out of the dryer, right? Maybe. And some of my ND folks, right? You may have left your clothes in the washer, or sorry, in the dryer overnight, and you go back, you're like, oh shoot, I forgot those clothes were in the dryer. And you go back and you feel them, and you may not be 100% sure whether they're dry or they're wet. Why is that? It's because we don't actually have a way of telling something is wet. What we do is we piece together different stimulus, right? Whether it's cold, certain textures or whatever, and we take those and we form a thought of this is what wetness is. And so when you go back into the dryer and you touch something and it's cold because it's been sitting there all night, it goes back and it's like, and makes your brain wonder if it's actually wet, right? And so it's important to understand that and know why that's a thought and a confusion, because again, it helps us to understand what how we're thinking, and again, when we do experience something that's so different or so confusing to our minds, well, why is that? We can go on to things like as well, like why cold technically doesn't exist, but I'm going to leave that for a different discussion. I'll probably put that into the show notes, for folks to chew on. But again, if these things are true, then what other constructs or what other thoughts are built into our mind, and how does that shape our reality? Um, we can think about unconscious bias, right? So this is, again, bringing this home is like, what have melanated and marginalized folks been pointing out, you know, as well as been trying to tell people to question about the structures that oppress us, right? It's about moving beyond the beliefs and the stimuli and considering what's at the root of our thoughts. How can we dismantle white supremacist, imperialist, capitalistic, heteronormative, heteronormative patriarchy without thinking about our thinking? This is one of the biggest challenges, is that people assume that their belief that they were taught, right, that they, acquired at a young age, that's the way that all of the world works, or that there's nothing to question beyond that. But thinking about our thinking makes us say, wait, hold on, maybe that's not right. Maybe gender roles don't have to be, true for my household. Maybe, yeah, maybe you quote unquote like to play the man's role, and you like to play the quote unquote woman's role, and that works for your household. Fine. But that doesn't mean that that is the absolute truth of the perfect way or the best way of doing things. And now I can choose something different that, again, as I said earlier, brings us closer to our peace. And so, as well, how can we stop treating neurodiversity as this binary of normal versus abnormal, right? Or sticking with pathological, uh, that something's medically wrong, right? That idea of thinking about various behaviors rather than centering human experiences and finding supports for people's needs. How can we do that without thinking about, excuse me, our thinking? And so, you know, this is something I'll just share a quick slide for. Um, so first of all, the question is, right, who's observing the observer? But there was this meme that I'm sharing, right? It says the neurodivergent experience is talking about your brain as if it's this separate entity from yourself. And I think many of us can relate to that. I cannot speak for what one would call neurotypical folks. But again, another question is, if your experience is that your brain is this sort of separate entity, what does that mean for how you interact with the world? In fact, I would say that a lot of the reason why neurodivergent people are more aware in this way, or perceive their experiences in this way, sure, there's probably something about our wiring, but I think a bigger part of that is because so much of the world is not built for us, and so there's so many more opportunities for us to bounce up against this thing that creates this awareness around our mind working differently, our mind being different, our mind not being totally tapped in to the exact way that this world is set up, if that makes sense. And so again, these are just important, I think, really, really important things about self-awareness that help us realize why we experience what we're experiencing. And again, for me, this is an opportunity to not see ourselves as broken, but also not see ourselves as um, you know possessing something otherworldly per se, right? Um, anyway, again, like I said, whole separate conversations that we can be having, right? And so again, this is also not just about Shelton babbling, right? This has real world implications for you know what I call melanated and marginalized communities. So how do you know when to look in the mirror, right? That's the next question. So here are some examples, right? Do you always, or do you spend a lot of time wishing that you could fix other people, especially those you love, especially those who are close to you, right? I wish that they would just, okay, there's an opportunity there, right? To look in the mirror. If you can't recognize your emotions, right? Maybe you're having challenges with understanding how you're feeling about something and being clear about how you feel about something. And I want to be clear and call out something that is a very real thing, which is, excuse me, people have heard me mention this in previous episodes, right? Is alexithymia, right? Which is essentially this condition where you literally are not able to easily access those emotions. You're not able to fully conceptualize them. And so somebody asking you, how do you feel? To them, if you hesitate, it may seem like there's uncertainty, like you're ambivalent, right? Or that you don't really care, or they can list this whole list of things, and it may be, I'm trying as hard as I can to tell you how I feel, but I just don't know. And maybe you're having that conversation with yourself and you're beating yourself up because you're like, I don't know why I don't know what I feel. These are opportunities to look in the mirror and say, again, maybe I have alexithymia, right? And now that I know that, I can go do something about that. I can kind of find my methods to kind of work within that system. Another example of when you need to kind of look in the mirror is if you lack emotional permanence. So what's emotional permanence? Well, if you know what object permanence is, it's the same thing. But let me say, if you don't know what that is, it's essentially the concept behind why little kids love peekaboo, right? Where it's basically when kids are very, very little babies, if they cannot see the face, if they cannot see the object, for them it's as if that thing is not there, right? That means it's gone. So now peekaboo is this really like curious thing for their brain, because your face is going away when you hide it, and then you reveal it, and it's like, oh, it's like it's there, it's not there, it's there, it's not there, right? So emotional permanence is this experience where if you don't have people they are telling you that they care about you, if you're not able to see these, like, very real reminders that they care about you, that they love you, or whatever, you may feel like it doesn't exist. And So if you're always seeking validation for things that you in your mind, right? I know that this person loves me, but I keep seeking this validation. And again, this isn't a judgment, but I think that we would all welcome an alternative to that, where we could feel secure or had ways to bring, us out of our swirling thoughts and into our body, or the place where we can sense that security and true knowing. Where we can realize it's our responsibility to provide ourselves security. And part of that is surrounding ourselves with people who are trustworthy and secure, right? There's a difference there, right? It's not constantly seeking validation externally and putting that onus and that responsibility on others to provide that to us. But it's about saying, I take responsibility for that. I need to figure out, again, if my partner has left the house or has gone to, maybe they're going on a business trip, or I don't know, right? They're just not here to remind me. Do I need to be messaging them throughout the day, right? Do I need to be, when they come in, like really on top of them about it? Again, that is what it is. There's nothing wrong with wanting to feel loved, but again, that can cause challenges. And so we can instead say, this is mine to own. I'm going to surround myself with people who are safe and secure, and for whom, if I do ask, they're willing to tell me, but also that I honor the fact that me asking them 100 times is, probably past the limit of what is healthy, right? And healthy for the relationship, really, right? Again, if there's a sign, if it's a sign, if you're always wondering why everyone else or someone else, isn't having the same experience of you as you, and it's not just like a curiosity, right? Like, I didn't know. I don't know what it's like to be an Asian woman, right? And maybe I'm curious about that, and I'd ask questions about what that's like, right? That's different. That's a curiosity. But there's a difference when it's like, yo, like, why do Asian women blah blah blah? Why would they want to? That's a very different thing. If that's right, if you're experiencing, big word consternation, right? But how can you, or why don't you just, opportunity to look in the mirror? When you keep finding yourself complaining about the same scenarios, the same types of people, and feeling at a loss as to why or how to address it, opportunity to look in the mirror. One of the things that I noticed about myself is that I was letting people control my emotions by not first understanding why I felt so strongly about them. So, for example, it's perfectly valid to be upset that someone didn't follow my directions and something went wrong with whatever the plan was. However, if I realize, and at the point that I realized that my day or mood was totally thrown off by that anger, and that I was dysregulated by it, I had to take the time, or I chose to take the time to look at myself and wonder, like, what belief am I holding that's telling me it's that deep, right? Because often something being done at 9 o'clock or that day or whatever, it wasn't the end of the world. Like, nobody lost a limb, nobody lost a life, right? But why did it feel so deep? And so this gets into a thing, again, it could be a whole another conversation about shadow work. And again, that does deserve its own episode, or me bringing on an expert to really talk about it, right? But in short, shadow work allows us to bring to the front of our minds limiting thoughts that we've been holding on to that have also caused us extra harm. So in this case, it's not just that things for me are not going that things for me not going according to plan is harmful or annoying, right? It's that maybe there was a parent, or maybe there was someone in my life that never listened to me, right? I just didn't feel listened to. Or maybe there was someone, who didn't make me feel secure in childhood. And so anything going awry, not according to plan, takes me back to that experience, right? And so now what I'm reacting to with that level of upset and dysregulation isn't that person across from me, isn't that thing that appeared in my life today. it's me reliving that. It's me telling myself, right, that um that I don't matter, that I'm not respected, right? Those are the shadow thoughts, right? And it brings us back to that wound. Why do you think that you don't matter? Why do you think that no one respects you? Go back to those earlier moments to dig into that, because then it's a powerful experience when you can acknowledge those feelings when they come up without taking it personally or telling ourselves, right, that those are the truths. Instead, we can say, you know what? And this actually literally happened like whatever last week. A developer came to me. They were supposed to have scheduled something. They didn't. They were kind of like putting the onus on me. Instead of getting upset, super upset and, defensive and whatever, I just flipped it around and said, hey, look, as you said yourself, right? You were supposed to schedule the meeting. It's not there. Fine, right? Why don't you instead, let's schedule Tuesdays and Fridays for, the next however long going forward. Now you're not waiting till the last second to schedule it. Now there's no risk of that not happening again. And, everybody's happy, right? So this is just a simple way in which these things can really benefit us. And, again, whether or not you're self-aware isn't about, intelligence in absolute terms, right? um, Even the most brilliant people can have things that exist outside of their current understanding. Um, Going back to that initial diagram that I showed, right? There's this knowing that's outside of everyone's ever possible knowing, right? And so, not knowing something, not being aware of how something's impacting us, is not necessarily an indication of intelligence. um, there was this video that I was watching that was talking about, Isaac Newton, one of the most brilliant minds ever, right? Well, Isaac Newton, if you brought Isaac Newton to the current day, Isaac Newton, despite all of his brilliance, would still be confused by a computer, would be confused by a car, right? You'd say, hey, let's get in the car and let's go buy a computer. Like, again, before you can even get into the internet and, apps and all that fun stuff, like, they'd be like, what's a car? Well, there's no concept for him of what a car is, and you've got to explain it to him. Now, most people listening to this, myself included, I would not consider myself to be more intelligent than Isaac Newton, but I would possess knowledge that he didn't, and I would have to explain that schema to him, that idea to him, right? And so I'm saying all that to say, like, if you don't know, feel free to not shame yourself and guilt yourself and judge yourself for not knowing, right? Because even the most intelligent people don't know something, right? Um, so there are some things to be said for being attached to some of these reactions, right? Some of these harmful reactions. And the reality is, again, due to trauma, due to other things, right? We can get attached to these coping mechanisms because that's how we survive for so long, to the point where we don't even recognize them as separate choices, right? They've been so ingrained into our minds. And so let me quickly show you 12 defense mechanisms um, that may be, of help for conceptualizing. And I'm not going to, give you all the absolute, I'll come back to that slide maybe, but um, I'm not going to go into all these in depth. Let me say it that way, right? But these are 12 defense mechanisms as defined by Sigmund Freud, right? And so the first is compensation, right? So we strengthen one part over here to hide another. I think we've all seen that, right? You're trying to hide the thing that, you don't want people to see by being super, super strong and masked in another area. Denial, refusing to face a negative behavior, right? Displacement, taking out what you're feeling on someone else, right? Identification, attaching to something positive. Introjection, conform feelings for your approval. Projection, this is probably, again, the one that we're most familiar with, right? Seeing our faults and foibles in others and pushing, again, going back to kind of this whole thing of like putting that challenge onto other people, as opposed to being able to see them in ourselves and dealing with them there. Rationalization, excusing and justifying mistakes. Reaction formation, pretending you're different. Regression, acting much younger to feel better. Some might call this, the learned helplessness, right? Again, separate conversation. Repression, putting things into darkness. And this goes back to the shadow thoughts, right? The things that we, particularly as young folks, we don't have the tools or the capacity to process. And so we repress them because the pain in the moment that we don't have the tools or the capacity to deal with, we repress them so that we don't have to deal with them. But they do come up later, right? The ritual and undoing, overriding negative with habit. And then lastly, sublimation, diverting negative into acceptable. And so again, not here to talk about each of these, and certainly not here to go in depth, but these are things to start to consider, to look up and start to chew on. And the power here is that, again, you don't have to accept those alternative reactions. You don't have to choose those coping mechanisms anymore. You can actually choose to address the underlying emotions now that you have the awareness, now that you have the tools, now that you have, the capacity, right? And so it goes back to that power of that shadow work. So what, right? The knowing, right? What can we do with all of this? And I'm starting to talk a little bit about that, right? One of the main things is that you come to this realization, as my good friend Muji, and technically he's not my friend, but one of my favorites, right? Muji, I was watching this video of his a couple months ago, and he said, "There's one Earth, but there are a billion worlds." And what does that mean? It refers to the fact that on this Earth there are over 8 billion people, but unto each of us is our own world. And so when we become self-aware, instead of there being this concept that, well, everybody experiences things the way that I do it, this is just the way that it is for everyone, we start to realize that everyone's got their own world and their own set of experiences. And it frees us from this thinking that, oh, this is why someone, well, if there's someone with a different world, the idea that they would have a separate preference or whatever feeling about something is not so challenging, right? There's also some realization around, well, let me put it to you like this. This is something I'm going to try to quickly read, but it's me talking about what I refer to as capital T and little t truth. And it's something that I wrote to some folks, or it's based upon something that I wrote to folks who we were in this thread discussing what truth is, what lies are, and all this other kind of stuff. So, what I said to them was, I think in this conversation and many that we have here, and let's talk about us here, and in this community, this podcast community, is like what we would do well to take time and to clarify are, the certain words that we are using, and acknowledging the nuances in the ways other people are using them. Right. So thinking even about like neurodivergence and what does that mean for you and what that means for someone else. And, you know, less trying to police that, but really trying to say, well, what is it that you really mean by that? Right. Excuse me. We have the opportunity to reflect back what we're hearing and not just share our truth. Right. That would help us all feel more heard and increase the possibility for learning and from each other. I'm sorry. And making sure we're not wasting time, quote unquote, arguing when we're actually on the same page and just using different wording. I hope that through this podcast, I'm demonstrating that I hear and see all of you, or that at least that's my desire, right? So, for example, I've heard people asking about the nature of truth and knowing, not just unto themselves, but in relationship to lies and ignorance. And so if truth and knowing are connected to what some might call God, then what then are lies and ignorance connected to? I often hear the question of how things which can be so subjective and malleable and changing can also be connected to something we tend to consider to be unchanging, definitive, and undefinable by humans, right? This idea of God or the universe or the supreme being or whatever, right? This all knowing, this all encompassing truth. And yeah, so some of my further thoughts are these. It's like, first, I don't really see lies as the opposite of truth. For me, in this discussion, there's a capital T truth, and that truth is what is. That capital T truth is that big circle, that pulsating circle that I showed at the beginning of this. Truth is like light. It is, and it contains many things while being experienced as one thing, right? Think about a prism, right? There's a light, which we all see just as that light, but when you put it through that prism, out come many things, many colors. So darkness isn't exactly the opposite of light, because darkness technically doesn't exist. Darkness is the absence of light, but lies aren't really the absence of truth. If lies, quote unquote, can someday become truth, and in this case, capital T truth. So darkness can never become light. And to that end, I was purposeful, as I said earlier, about using capital T and lowercase t truth for this reason. So lowercase t truth to me is the broken shards of what I'll call the God mirror. And therefore, quote unquote, lies are the warped and limited image you can see in a shard of that mirror rather than the entire picture. And so a lowercase truth can become a quote unquote lie based on the angle, the light, excuse me, in which you're viewing it, and even the distance at which you're, holding up the shard. I mean, if you tried to hold a broken piece of a mirror to an elephant's leg at night, how much different would it look if you waited until day and took a couple steps back, right? Would the capital T truth have changed, or just the lowercase truth or that lie? So all this is to say, if we put all our shards together, right, all these many minds, these many worlds together, we can see the full capital T truth. And it contains pieces of all the lowercase t truths and the lies, but it reveals a much different picture than what we could have seen by just having our own individual shard. And also, to complete the analogy, if capital T truth is the light, then we're often looking through our own prism or kaleidoscope, right? And our goal should be to find a way to bring all those things back together to see, quote unquote, that the truth, to quote unquote, see that the truth, see the truth and the light. I'm sorry. Okay. And so that's my, thoughts on that. And I'll share a video again in the interest of time. It's his Facebook video that just demonstrates what you can see from the different angles, and it's just, like I said, goes a little bit deeper into that thought. So knowing who I am and how I show up, also, these are different things, right? So this is what knowing can do for us. We all have beliefs about ourselves, but it's also important to know how we show up with other people and how it looks from a different angle, right? And so I'm going to show a quick, example of this. And so for those who can't see, it's like a meme. It says, me. I will let my child make their own choices. Also me. That ornament doesn't go on that branch, right? And so I thought this was a great example of this sort of duality and experience. Like, in my mind, I give people all the choices. Like, I don't have any children at this point, but if I were a parent, I might be telling myself, you can do everything that you want. Like, you have all the choices, right? But then at the same time, maybe I gave them the opportunity to choose all the colors of the ornaments and the ornaments, whatever. Maybe they wanted to use, traditional Christmas ornaments, or maybe they wanted to use ones that were, that they made. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, right? But then if I'm telling them that, well, that ornament doesn't go on that branch, it has to go higher up, or that it goes in the back, or, like, I don't know, right? Well, this may be an opportunity again to look in the mirror and say, here's a dynamic by which, yeah, maybe I am more open, But when someone shows up and tells me that they're feeling controlled by my actions, there's an opportunity to say, oh, I guess telling you to which branch to go on does constitute control, right? And so two things, as they say, right, can be true at the same time, but it also is a perfect opportunity to see where my truth, my lowercase truth, can still remain, but where someone else's lowercase truth can also be honored, right? And together we can get a capital T truth, right? Which does not require either one of us to give up what we believe, right? We can expand upon it, but we don't have to give up that thing, and that we don't have to invalidate. More importantly, let me say it that way: we don't have to invalidate the other's experience. I hope that's making sense, and I hope that's helpful. As well, this can push us to do what Jerry Colonna calls radical self-inquiry, right? And what is radical self-inquiry? It's the process by which the masks that we wear are slowly and compassionately stripped away so that we have no place left to hide, right? And I heard this on a podcast he was on. I don't know when it's from, but it's super, super powerful, right? I love that description. And I also love that he brought into the space this question of how he's a white man. So he's asking, like, how have I benefited from systemic othering, right? How do we acknowledge our privilege? And again, could be a whole separate conversation, but to be clear, privilege in my mind, right? And generally in practice is not about saying that you don't have, any problems. As a black man, I am both a, person for whom the system is oppressing, but as a man, I also have male privilege. Maybe not as much as Jerry, but as a man, I definitely have to acknowledge that privilege. And so how can I be mindful, again, be self-aware of the benefit I've derived from othering, others? And here's the most important thing, the most critical question, right? Is what might I be willing to give up that I love to see the changes that I actually want to see? And so when Jerry said that, that really, really hit home for me. Again, what might I be willing to give up that I love to see the changes that I actually want to see? And so that kind of draws us into we're rounding out here. It says, what are the drawbacks of self-awareness? Right? So what are the drawbacks? This all sounds good. It sounds like it's helping us. Sounds like a lot of work, but it does seem right. Like these are the things that we should be pursuing. But what are some of the drawbacks? Well, let's talk about some of the reactions that we might expect to see or hear. Well, first off, most people aren't doing this work. That's one of the biggest realizations that has hit me in recent times, right? Like, and I think I may have said this in previous episodes, but shout out to the Soul Affirmations podcast, because this is where I first heard this, where they said, just because you're grown doesn't mean you're growing, right? And so there's lots of grown folks out there that are not growing. And to that end, people are uncomfortable with others who are self-aware because it makes them sense their lack of self-awareness. Right, on a deep or an unconscious level, it can seem similar to that feeling that many of us remember of being in class and worrying that we'll be the next person to be called on. But you haven't done the assignment, or you haven't read the book, right? That angst. Oh shoot, I'm going to be found out. Oh shoot, I'm going to have to answer for something that I don't have the answer for. And so maybe you never get called on, but that sudden urge to curl up, to hide and defend yourself is very, very similar. And that's what people are experiencing. And so we can, again, this is not about placating their behavior, or saying their reaction to us is quote unquote okay, but we can have compassion in that, because we realize, again, it's not personal. And when it's not personal, we don't have to defend ourselves. We can say, okay, you're not comfortable with yourself, you're not aware of yourself, and I can choose something different. But I don't have to make it an attack, or, again, to feel like I'm defending myself. Another thing that comes out of self-awareness is, again, this realization, truly realizing, right, that ignorance is bliss, and that the more you know, the more you know. And that means also that it's the more cognitive, right? Going back to cognition, thinking, more load that we spend on addressing this dissonance, right? And making decisions. So it means that the more that we know, the more time that we're spending being aware of how our actions are impacting others, and also how, some of the things that we are thinking don't align. I was listening to this podcast earlier, and they were talking about the beef between Kendrick Lamar and Drake, and a lot of people who would quote unquote be considered conscious, right, siding with Kendrick. But if what Drake said, and to be clear, I have not listened to 90 at least percent of the battle, so I'm just going off of what they said and what I've heard other people say. But it seems like Drake accused Kendrick of beating on his wife or partner, and so there was this question of like, well, am I a hypocrite? I'm talking about Drake because it seems like he possibly is grooming little girls, but then if I'm siding with Kendrick and I'm not, kind of taking him to bat for um his potential alleged, right, treatment of his partner, like what does that say for me? And so the more aware you are, the more you start to question this and aren't just like, oh, this is the rap beef, right? It can't just be a rap beef for you anymore and just back and forth, which again, no judgment in that regard, right? I'm just saying that's the reality, is that then you start to have those kinds of questions and you can't really avoid them as much. And then there's a point at which the things can then become less self-reflection and more self-dissection, and more putting ourselves on trial. And so we have to be very mindful of this, right? Not trying to prove that we're good or not good, or that we're lovable or not lovable, that we're smart enough or not, or that we belong, right? All these different things, right? We again, going back to this whole discussion about this whole Drake and Kendrick thing, right? In this situation, it's it's normal to have two separate thoughts. And sure, let's not leave feeling like a hypocrite, but at the same time, we don't have to beat ourselves up about enjoying Kendrick's music, while at the same time, you know there potentially being something more there, something destructive there, something harmful there. Again, find ways to reconcile that, but we don't have to. What some people end up doing is, responding by being like, "See, I do all this domestic violence work," or "See, I do all this." Maybe they're a Drake fan and they're like, "See, I do all this stuff to prevent sex trafficking," and it's like, you're just trying to overcompensate as opposed to making peace with what the truth is. Um, and so again, as we start to do all this, a lot of things can come up, right? It can make us aware of times where we've even wanted help, and we've actually self-sabotaged because the attention and the support that we received felt better in this season, right? Um, that's a big one. I'm not saying that lightly, and again, I'm not trying to trivialize or invalidate anybody's experience, but I think that we all recognize there have been times when, you know, we have said we wanted help, we wanted to do better, but then we keep choosing things or people that have kept us in a particular place. And it's because, we tell ourselves that, we love them, or, it's because we tell ourselves that, um, whatever, we get some sort of benefit out of it. Maybe it's a financial one, maybe it's a status one, maybe it's whatever. And again, no judgment for that. I mean, life is messy, right? But figuring out, going back to what I was saying, the question that was asked earlier, right? What might I be willing to give up that I love to see the changes that I actually want to see? And sometimes, again, giving up isn't a complete separation. Again, maybe it's a boundary. Maybe it's a way in which we, again, interact with that thing. Maybe it's, again, let's take it away from, people. Maybe it's, I like video games. I'm not going to give up video games, but maybe I play less because I know that that's the only way that I'm going to be productive during the day or during the evening, or spend time with my family or whatever it is, right? I still love that thing. I don't have to completely give it up. But every time I keep saying I want to have a stronger relationship with my child, again, I don't have children, just speaking hypothetically here, right? If I want to spend time with my child, but I'm not making choices that prioritizes that, then I've got, again, opportunity to look in the mirror. And the more that we look in the mirror, that's when we start to see these things, right? Um, even parents. Well, let me leave that for another conversation, because I'm trying to, again, I'm looking at the time. So um so again, this may all push us to be, to let go of beliefs and coping mechanisms that have helped us survive. And that's one of the scariest things, because we've been using those things to survive for so long. The idea of giving them up seems scary. It's like, oh shoot, I still need these things. This is how I survive. And instead of getting to the point where we realize that's how I did survive, that's how I needed to survive, but I'm not there anymore. Again, shadow work, inner child work will really, really help with that. Separate conversation. But this is the kind of thing that comes up. And I'll share this Baldwin quote before I start to truly round out. But, you know, Baldwin said, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with the pain. And I'm not trying to bend this, too far to fit, a particular narrative, or take the real focus of that, which, is larger systems of oppression. And I'm not trying to like completely disentangle that. But why I share that quote is because, when we've experienced a lot of different trauma, there's a point at which we have to say, you know what? I experienced this thing. It was terrible. It hurt. It's still going to hurt to some extent. It's still not going to feel good to relive this thing, but I want something more. I want something beyond this. And so the way that I deal with that is by, realizing I can't just cut everybody off, right? I can't just say all people like that look like this, that sound like this, or whatever, whatever are just bad. Maybe, you know, you had a bad experience with a woman, and, you've just said, I ain't dealing with women no more. Or maybe you said, I'm not being vulnerable with a woman anymore, right? Well, at some point, if you really want to have the larger experience, you've got to say to yourself, well, that woman or those women that I experienced were not safe. And that sucks. And I've got to deal with that pain, because holding on to that hate, yeah, it keeps me safe per se, right? Like no one can hurt me, quote unquote. But it means that I'm missing out on a larger experience. And so I just want to put that there, because um yeah, as it relates to, again, larger systems of oppression, a lot of people, let me just make sure that I speak it into this space, right? A lot of people don't want to stop hating and oppressing other people, because it would mean having to reflect upon the harm that they've done, the harm that their people like them have done. It would also make them aware, as I spoke earlier about, right, the ways in which they've benefited from other people being harmed, and that they just kind of stood on the sidelines and again, reap those benefits. And that's a painful thing to deal with. So anyway, the truth is we can be more than one thing. And I don't believe in traditional ideas of good and bad people in some sort of absolute way, right? We all have good and bad in us, quote unquote, right? And the difference is really in how we hold and process those things. We could have more than one feeling or belief. They just can't fundamentally be in conflict. And to be clear, being different or even seemingly belonging to opposite labels doesn't mean conflict is inherent, doesn't mean that they are definitively in conflict. You know, tomatoes are a fruit, right, as they say, but you wouldn't put them in a fruit salad, right? A platypus is a mammal, but well, well, those guys are just wild, right? Those are just really, really, strange creatures, right? But they exist just fine, right? And so some of this is realizing that to some extent, words and labels aren't defined by some absolute nature, but the context in which those words are used. And words have limitations, right? But they're the best way that we have to exchange ideas without, right, telepathy. And maybe, someday we'll be able to do that, right? We'll be Bajoran or something, right? So, um, we'll be Professor X with the little, right? Shout out to X-Men 97 for all the fans of the X-Men series. But the healing journey requires that we not seek perfection in ourselves, in our past, or in our future, but rather that we acknowledge that all the colors of our human experience and we acknowledge all the colors of our human experience and acquire and recognize the tools we have to face all of them, right? Self-awareness might be the most critical tool, though, because it makes sure we're able to recognize the path to where we want to be and when we're stumbling too far astray. And so the last quote that I will share is from J. Mike Fields. Shout out to J. Mike Fields. I'll tag you in this post. But the quote says, "The core of healing is self-awareness. In this space, we remember our wholeness. We walk ourselves home." And with that, I'm complete. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I hope and pray that it has been helpful. I hope that it's made you think. I hope that it's just made you feel heard, right? And if so, please, right now, don't wait. Go ahead and share it. Go ahead and comment on the post where you saw it. But certainly, please share it with someone who you think might benefit from it. With that, I'm complete. Take care. Catch you on the next episode. Thank you for joining me for another episode of I Must Be BUGN. I hope you've learned something, became curious, and most importantly, felt affirmed by what you heard. Remember, this podcast is all about sharing compassionate narratives about who we are and how we contribute to the beautiful and necessary diversity of humanity. This is our place to unmask and just be. Don't forget to connect with me on IG at I Must Be BUGN, where I'm eager to see you share your thoughts, your experiences, and your stories. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Leave a review and subscribe. It helps others who are eager for community find our people. So thank you again for being a part of the I Must Be BUGN community. I can't wait for the next episode. Until then, stay up and enjoy who you were meant to be. And remember, you're not bugging, you're brilliant.